wind had a name in that part of the country, patience. It was a liar. It came with no fury, no sudden blast to knock a man from his saddle. It came as a whisper, a slow gathering of dust from 1,000 barren miles, lifting the topsoil from Texas to Kansas and carrying it west. It built for days, a yellow haze on the horizon that bled the blue from the sky, until the sun was a dull, cataracted eye in a jaundiced heaven. Then it would arrive. Not a storm, but a siege. The town of redemption, Nevada, was dying of thirst and patience. It had been born on a silver strike that turned out to be more rumor than rock, and now it clung to the cracked earth like a scab. The dust settled in the ruts of the main street, on the warped planks of the boardwalk, and in the lungs of the few souls desperate or stubborn enough to remain. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated everything, a constant reminder of decay. Inside the Silver Queen Saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap perfume. But even here, the dust found a way in. It formed a film on the dark, scarred wood of the bar and settled on the shoulders of the men hunched over their glasses. On a small, creaking stage in the corner, a woman was singing. Her name was Lena. She was not yet 30, but the years had been unkind, leaving shadows beneath her cheekbones and a permanent tension in the set of her jaw. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up in a way that might have been elegant once, but now looked merely functional, a measure to keep it from falling into her eyes as she worked. She wore a dress of watered silk, the color of a faded bruise, its hem frayed and stained. It was a costume, a uniform for a role she played 6 nights a week. Her voice was the most honest thing about her. It was not pretty. It was not the clear, bell-like tone of a church choir soprano. It was a bruised voice, a thing of smoke and gravel, with a crackle in it like dry leaves underfoot. When she sang, the notes seemed to be pulled from a place of deep hurt, yet they carried a strange, defiant strength. She sang of lost loves and lonely trails, of men who rode away and women who waited, the cowboys and prospectors, the whiskey-soaked loners and the weary freight drivers. They listened. They did not understand the woman, but they understood the ache in her song. It was their own. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above their heads, a smudge on the far wall where a bottle had once shattered. It was a trick she had learned long ago, to see them without looking at them. She saw the glint of their belt buckles, the greasy brims of their hats, the way their mouths hung slack with drink and desire. She felt their gazes on her like a physical weight, hungry and possessive. They looked at her skin, at the curve of her throat where a pulse beat steadily, at the swell of her chest as she drew breath to sing. They looked, but they did not see her. To them, she was a fixture, another bottle to be emptied, another pleasure to be bought and paid for. When the song ended, a smattering of applause broke the silence, punctuated by a few raw-throated whoops. A coin arced through the air and landed with a clatter on the stage. Lena did not bend to pick it up. She gave a small, stiff nod, her face a mask of polite indifference, and stepped back as the piano player, a rheumy-eyed old man named Silas, launched into a more raucous tune. Her work for the moment was done. She slipped through a curtain behind the stage and climbed a narrow, steep set of stairs. The noise of the saloon faded below, replaced by the creak of her own footsteps and the low moan of the wind against the eaves. Her room was in the attic, a cramped space tucked under the peaked roof. It was not a home. It was a cage. The furniture consisted of a narrow cot, a rickety washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single wooden chair. A small, grimy window looked out not on the town, but on an endless expanse of sagebrush and sky. Now, a uniform, suffocating ochre. This room, the dress she wore, the food she ate, it all belonged to Roy Manson. He was the owner of the Silver Queen, a man with a soft, fleshy face and eyes as cold and hard as river stones. He had found her 5 years ago in a dirty boarding house in Cheyenne, sick and starving. He called it a rescue. He reminded her of it often, his voice a low, proprietary murmur. I gave you a roof. Lena, I put you on that stage. You owe me. He believed it, and he had spent the past 5 years collecting on the debt, taking his payment in her songs, in her compliance, and in the fear he saw in her eyes. He owned her, as surely as he owned the deed to the saloon. Lena poured water from the pitcher into the basin. It was lukewarm and tasted of alkali. She untied the laces of her dress and let it fall to the floor in a heap of tired silk. In the dim light, her shoulders were pale, almost luminous, faint. Ghost-like marks marbled the skin near her collarbone, the faded fingerprints of a life she never spoke of. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would dream of it, of gas lamps and velvet curtains, of manicured gardens and the cool, smooth feel of ivory keys beneath her fingertips. She had played the piano once, in drawing rooms that smelled of beeswax and roses, her hands clad in soft, white silk gloves. A different life, a different girl, a girl who had made a mistake, a terrible, ruinous mistake that had sent her running west, shedding her name and her past like a snake sheds its skin. She had been running ever since. She washed the cheap paint from her face, scrubbing until her skin was raw. The face that stared back at her from the cracked sliver of mirror was a stranger's, thin, weary, and guarded. There were no tears. She had run out of those years ago. There was only a hollow, aching resolve to survive another night, to breathe in and breathe out, down below. The door of the Silver Queen swung open, letting in a swirl of dust and a man who seemed to be carved from the harsh landscape itself. His name was Bo Ransom. He was not a tall man, but broad in the shoulder, with a stillness about him that made him seem larger than he was. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who conserves his energy because he knows the world is determined to take it from him. His face was weathered, browned by the sun and etched with lines that spoke of squinting into long distances and longer sorrows. His eyes, a pale, faded blue, were the most unsettling thing about him. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and had found the abyss looking back. They were haunted. He did not belong here. He had ridden into Redemption that afternoon with a small herd of 20 longhorns, the last remnant of a ranch that had once been his life's work. They were his brother's cattle. Really, his brother, Tom, who had died of a fever 2 months back, leaving Bo with a final, whispered request. Sell 'em. Get what you can, and get out. Don't let this land have you too. Bo had every intention of honoring that request. He had already found a buyer, a man passing through with a larger herd, headed for the rail yards in California. The deal was done. The money, a thin stack of bills, was tucked into his shirt pocket. Tomorrow, at first light, he would ride east, away from the dust and the ghosts. He would find a place where the ground was soft and the rain fell, a place with no memories. He did not know if such a place existed, but he had to try. He made his way to the bar, choosing a spot at the far end, in the deepest shadow. He ordered a whiskey and paid for the bottle. He had no interest in conversation. He had come to the saloon for one reason, to get drunk enough to sleep without dreaming. He poured a glass, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. He drank it down in one long, smooth swallow, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He had known loss. Oh, he had known it intimately. He had held his wife, Sarah, as the consumption stole the breath from her lungs, her body growing lighter each day until she was little more than a bird skeleton in his arms. And he had buried his infant son a week later, the small wooden box feeling impossibly light, as if he were burying a handful of air. That was 4 years ago. 4 years, 3 months, and 6 days. He had counted every one. On the day he laid them in the ground, he had made a vow. He had stood over their graves, the wind tearing at his coat, and he had sworn he would never feel anything again. Love, hope, joy. They were traps. They were the bait the world used to lure you in before it snapped its jaws shut. He had walled off his heart with stone and mortar, and he would let no one inside. From the corner of his eye, he saw the singer return to the stage. He had noticed her earlier. When he first walked in, he had noticed the way the lamplight caught in her hair and the tired grace of her movements. He had heard the sorrow in her voice and felt a flicker of something he refused to name, a dangerous spark of recognition. Now, he deliberately turned his gaze away, focusing on the distorted reflection of his own face in the dark wood of the bar. He poured another drink. Lena began her second set. The crowd had thinned a little, the more respectable townsfolk having gone home to their beds. The ones who remained were the hardcore drinkers, the men with nowhere else to go. Their eyes were greedier now, their comments louder, coarser. A big beefy man with a stained beard, a drover from the cattle train, bellowed for a bawdy song. Lena ignored him, her gaze still fixed on the far wall. She began a slow, mournful ballad about a riverboat gambler who loses everything. Her voice, raw and aching, filled the room. It cut through the haze of smoke and the clatter of glasses, and despite himself, Bo found that he was listening. He did not look at her, but he heard her. He heard the story of a man broken by chance and his own weakness, and it resonated with the raw, hollow space inside him. This woman, with her painted face and bruised voice, she knew something of ruin. The song ended. The drover, angry at being ignored, slammed his mug on a table. "I said sing something a man can clap to, you miserable crow!" A young barmaid, Millie, a girl no older than 16 with frightened rabbit eyes, hurried over to his table. "Please, sir, keep your voice down." The drover grabbed her wrist, his thick fingers swallowing her arm. "Or what, little mouse? You'll squeak at me?" Lena's voice cut across the room, quiet but sharp as a shard of glass. "Let her go." Every head in the saloon turned. The drover looked up, his face a mask of drunken belligerence. "You talking to me?" "Her wrist is no bigger than a sapling," Lena said, her eyes finally leaving the safety of the far wall and locking onto his. "I imagine it would snap just as easily. Let her go." There was a moment of charged silence. The man's pride was on the line. He sneered, but something in Lena's unblinking stare made him hesitate. With a grunt, he shoved Millie's arm away. The girl stumbled back, rubbing her wrist, tears welling in her eyes. The drover turned his glare back to Lena. "You got a mouth on you, singer. One of these days, Manson's gonna shut it for good." Lena's expression did not change. She simply turned and walked off the stage, disappearing through the curtain. The tension in the room broke. Men went back to their drinks, the moment already forgotten. But Bo had seen it all. He had seen the flash of defiance in the singer's eyes, and the tremor in her hands that she tried to hide. He finished his glass and pushed himself away from the bar. He needed air. The saloon felt close, suffocating. He made his way to the back door, stepping out into a narrow, dark alleyway. The wind had died down, but the air was still thick with dust. He took a deep breath, the grit coating the back of his throat. From a side door, he heard voices, Roy Manson's soft, venomous tone, and Lena's, low and strained. "You think you run this place?" Manson was saying. He was hurting her. "That is not your concern. Your concern is to sing your songs, look pretty, and keep your mouth shut. You embarrassed me in front of my customers. You forget your place. Lena." Then came a sound that made the muscles in Bo's back go rigid, a sharp, wet crack, the sound of a man's open palm striking a woman's face. It was followed by a choked gasp, but not a cry. Bo did not think. He did not weigh the consequences. He did not remind himself of his vow. The man he had been for 4 years, the numb, dead man, vanished. In his place was someone older, someone who remembered what it was to protect, to defend. He rounded the corner of the building. Manson had Lena pressed against the rough plank wall. His hand raised to strike her again. Lena's head was turned, a dark smudge of a bruise already blooming on her cheek. But her eyes were fixed on him, blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Beau's voice was a low growl. "Get your hands off her!" Manson turned, surprised. His face, usually a pale mask of control, twisted in a snarl. "This is none of your business, Cowboy. Move along." "I said, get your hands off her," Beau repeated, taking a step forward. His own hands, calloused and scarred from years of rope and rain, clenched into fists at his sides. Manson laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You want to be a hero? Fine." He gestured to a hulking shape that had been lurking in the shadows. It was his enforcer, a man known only as Cole, a mountain of a man with a broken nose and small, mean eyes. Cole stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. He was twice Beau's size. Beau knew, with a grim certainty, that this was going to hurt. He didn't care. All he could see was the mark on Lena's cheek and the fire in her eyes. He met Cole's charge head-on. There was no finesse to it, no skill. It was a raw, desperate collision of flesh and bone. Beau ducked under a wild swing and drove his fist into the big man's gut. The blow was like hitting a side of beef. Cole grunted, surprised, and swung again, his fist catching Beau high on the cheekbone. Stars exploded behind Beau's eyes. He staggered back, the taste of blood flooding his mouth, but the pain only fueled the cold rage inside him. He lowered his head and charged, driving his shoulder into Cole's midsection, sending them both crashing into a stack of empty barrels. The fight was short and brutal. It ended with Beau on his knees, breathing in ragged gasps, his knuckles split and bleeding, his face a mess of cuts and bruises. But Cole was lying on his back in the dirt, groaning, his nose bleeding freely. Manson looked from his fallen enforcer to Beau, his eyes glittering with cold fury. He took a step toward Lena, who had not moved from the wall. "This changes nothing," he hissed at her, then turned and stalked back into the saloon. The alley was quiet again, except for the sound of Beau's ragged breathing and Cole's low moans. Beau spat a mouthful of blood and dust onto the ground. He tried to push himself up, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. A shadow fell over him. It was Lena. She stood looking down at him, her expression unreadable. The bruise on her cheek was darker now, a violent splash of purple against her pale skin. "Are you broken?" she asked, her voice flat. "Not yet," he managed to rasp. She held out a hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. Her fingers were cool and surprisingly strong. She helped him to his feet. He swayed, and her other hand came up to steady his arm. They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by the stink of stale beer and violence. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's get you cleaned up." She led him not back into the saloon, but through a side door and into a small, cluttered storeroom. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging liquor. Barrels were stacked to the ceiling, and shelves were crammed with dusty bottles. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. She pushed him gently onto an upturned crate and rummaged through a cabinet, producing a bottle of whiskey and a strip of what looked like clean linen. She said nothing as she uncorked the bottle and poured a generous amount onto the cloth. "This will sting," she warned. He just nodded, gritting his teeth. She knelt in front of him and took his right hand. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm and steady. She began to clean the blood from his split knuckles. The whiskey bit into the raw flesh, a clean, sharp fire. Beau flinched but did not pull away. He watched her as she worked, in the soft lantern light. The hardness in her face seemed to melt away. He could see the faint web of lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her lower lip that she was trying to control. He saw the woman, not the singer. Their hands touched. His was a cowboy's hand, thick and calloused, the skin cracked and stained by sun and dirt and labor. Hers was slender and pale, a musician's hand, meant for grace. Not for this grimy, violent world. The contrast was stark, a story in itself. The silence in the storeroom grew, becoming a heavy, living thing between them. It was filled with the things they were not saying, the questions they were not asking. He did not ask about the bruise on her cheek. She did not ask why he had fought a battle that was not his. Finally, she finished wrapping the linen around his knuckles, tying it off with a neat, practiced knot. But she did not let go of his hand. Her thumb stroked gently over his wrist, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that he had not felt in 4 long years. It terrified him. She looked up, her eyes the color of moss in deep shade, meeting his. She offered a small, crooked smile that did not reach them. "You put up a good fight," she said, her voice low. "For a man set on drinking himself to death." He didn't smile back. Had to be good for something. The corner of her mouth twitched again. She seemed to be studying his face, her gaze lingering on the cut on his cheek, the weariness in his eyes. He felt stripped bare, as if she could see past the wall he had built and straight into the empty, ruined chambers of his heart. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The scent of her, a faint mix of lilac soap and whiskey, filling his senses. "You're not like them," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement, a verdict. The others, they look, but they never see. The words were an offering, a small, fragile seed of trust planted in the barren soil of his soul. And it was his duty, to himself, to his vow, to Sarah, to crush it before it could take root. He pulled his hand from her grasp. "Don't be sure," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. It was a warning, meant as much for himself as for her. A warning to stay away, to not look for a hero where there was only a ghost. Outside, a low rumble echoed across the plains. Thunder, distant at first, then closer. A deep, guttural growl from the belly of the sky. The air in the small room grew heavy, charged with an unspoken energy. A storm was coming, not just of wind and rain, but of something deeper, something more dangerous, something that had been sparked to life in a dark alleyway by a single act of foolish, reckless kindness. And as they stared at each other in the flickering lantern light, both Lena and Bo knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was already too late to run for cover. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world washed and wounded. The rain had turned the dust to a thick, red mud that clung to everything, and the air, for the first time in weeks, was clean and sharp. Smelling of wet sage and distant pine, it was a false purity, a clean sheet laid over a sick bed. The town of Redemption looked even more desolate in the clear morning light, its weathered facades and broken boardwalks exposed and unsparing. Bo Ransom felt as though the storm had taken place inside his own skull. He sat on the edge of a lumpy cot in a room at the boarding house, his head throbbing in time with a dull ache in his knuckles. His face was a patchwork of purple and blue, and his cheekbone felt like a hot coal pressed against the skin. He had not slept. He had spent the night staring into the darkness. The image of Lena's blazing eyes burned onto the back of his eyelids. The feel of her hand in his a phantom warmth he could not shake. He was supposed to be gone, his horse saddled, the sun at his back, Redemption shrinking to a speck in the distance. That had been the plan. A simple plan for a simple man. But last night, he had done something that was not simple at all. He had interfered. He had stepped out of the numb, gray fog he had inhabited for 4 years and into the messy, violent world of another human being. He regretted it with every aching bone in his body. He splashed cold water on his face from a basin, the shock doing little to clear his head. He had to leave. Now, before this went any further, before he did something even more foolish. He pulled on his boots, ignoring the protest of his bruised ribs, and walked out into the morning. And there she was. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the Silver Queen, in the long shadow cast by the building. She was barefoot, her toes curling slightly in the damp, cool air. The hem of her plain wool skirt was dark with moisture. She was staring out at the main street, at nothing in particular, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding in a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Manson had been thorough. Her lip was split, a thin, dark line of clotted blood against the pale skin. The bruise on her cheek, which had been a smudge last night, had ripened into a dark, ugly flower. She had not bothered to cover it with powder. It was a statement, a flag of defiance, or perhaps one of defeat. With Lena, it was hard to tell. She did not look at him as he approached, but he knew she was aware of his presence. He could see the tightening of the muscles in her shoulders. He stopped a few feet away, the silence stretching between them. He should have kept walking. He should have tipped his hat, gone to the livery, and ridden out of her life forever. But he could not. His feet felt nailed to the warped planks of the boardwalk. He cleared his throat. "There is coffee at the hotel," he said, his voice a rough croak. "It is probably sludge, but it is hot." For a long moment, she did not move or speak. He thought she was going to ignore him, to let his words hang in the air until they dissolved. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of something in their mossy depths. Surprise, maybe, or perhaps just a deep, bottomless weariness. She said nothing, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He bought 2 tin cups of the coffee, which was every bit as bad as he had predicted, and handed one to her. Her fingers brushed against his, and that same unnerving current passed between them. She did not pull away. They stood for another minute, drinking the scalding, bitter liquid, the silence a shield for them both. The town was beginning to stir. A blacksmith hammered at an anvil down the street, the rhythmic clang echoing in the clean air. A few men tipped their hats as they passed, their eyes lingering on Lena's bruised face and then flicking to Beau's, a look of knowing amusement in their gaze. Beau felt a slow, hot anger begin to build in his gut. "Let's walk," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. She did not ask where. She simply fell into step beside him, her bare feet making soft, slapping sounds on the damp wood. They walked past the general store, past the assayer's office with its boarded-up windows, past the church whose steeple leaned like a tired old man. They left the town behind, following a faint track that led toward a line of skeletal cottonwoods marking the path of a long dead creek. The ground was soft here, the mud less clinging. The sun was higher now, its warmth beginning to chase the chill from the air. They stopped at the edge of the dry creek bed, a wide, sandy scar in the earth littered with smooth, pale stones, a place of endings. Lena stared down at the stones, turning her cup in her hands. "I used to play the piano," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear it. "In a house with windows so big you felt like you were living outside. The piano was an Erard, from Paris. Grand, made of rosewood. The keys were ivory, cool as a river stone on a summer day." Beau said nothing. He leaned against the trunk of a cottonwood, his arms crossed over his chest, and listened. He did not know why she was telling him this, but he knew it was important. It was a piece of herself, offered up like a rare and fragile gift. "My father said a lady's hands should never be idle," she continued, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "So I played Chopin, Beethoven, hours and hours, until my fingers ached. I always wore gloves when I played. White silk. Can you imagine?" She looked at her own hands then, at the calloused fingertips and the dirt under her nails. "I suppose he got his wish. My hands are never idle now." She took a final sip of her coffee and set the empty cup on the ground. "Then I traded it all," she said, her voice hardening. "The piano, the silk gloves, the big windows, traded it for cheap whiskey, a creaking stage, and this, She touched her split lip with the tip of her finger, a gesture of such casual, accepted pain that it made Beau's chest ache. Sometimes I cannot remember if it was a fair trade. She fell silent, her gaze lost in the empty space of the creek bed. Beau watched her, seeing for the first time the ghost of the other woman she had been, the girl in the silk gloves. He felt the weight of her unspoken story, the vast, dark ocean of things that had happened between the rosewood piano and this saloon in the middle of nowhere. He had no words of comfort to offer. Platitudes were lies, and he was a poor liar. So he gave her the only thing he had, his silence. He stood there, a silent witness, and let her be. They walked back to town as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows. The mood had shifted. Her confession had changed the air between them, creating a bond as thin and fragile as a spider's thread, but a bond nonetheless, and the town noticed. As they stepped back onto the main boardwalk, two cowboys were leaning against a post outside the land office. They watched Lena approach, their eyes crawling over her with a lazy, insolent familiarity. One of them, a lanky man with a wad of tobacco bulging in his cheek, nudged his friend. "Well, looky here," he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it ain't Manson's songbird, looks like she's trying to act like a wife now, walking out with a fella in the morning." He spat a stream of brown juice that landed inches from Lena's bare feet. Lena flinched. It was a small, sharp movement, as if she had been struck. Her whole body went rigid, her face pale, but then she straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin, her eyes fixed straight ahead, and she walked past them as if they were nothing more than rocks on the side of the road. Beau stopped. The hot anger in his gut coiled into a tight, dangerous knot. He turned to face the man. "You have something you want to say to me?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The cowboy's smirk wavered. He looked at Beau's bruised face, at his bandaged knuckles, and at the dead calm look in his eyes. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose. And that was a man you did not trifle with. He looked away, suddenly finding the pattern of the wood grain on the post fascinating. Beau held his gaze for a second longer, then turned and followed Lena. He caught up to her outside the saloon. She was standing with her back to him, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Lena," he said softly. "Just go," she whispered, her voice thick. "Just get on your horse and ride away from this place." "I aim to," he said. He went to the livery stable. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Duke, was waiting for him. The money from the cattle sale felt like a lead weight in his pocket. He just had to saddle up and go. He checked the horse's legs out of habit, running a hand down each one. When he got to the left foreleg, Duke shied away, favoring it. Beau looked closer and swore under his breath. The horse had thrown a shoe. The hoof was already starting to chip. He could not ride him more than a mile or two like this, not without laming him for good. The farrier, a grizzled old man named Jedediah, looked at the hoof and then at Beau. "That's a bad bit of luck," he said, his eyes filled with a pity that grated on Beau's nerves. "Looks like you are stuck here for another day. Son, I got 3 wagons ahead of you." Frustration, sharp and bitter, rose in Beau's throat. He felt trapped, a fly caught in a web. Fine, he still had the small wagon he and his brother had used, the one parked behind the stable. It was not much, but he could load his gear, hitch up Duke, and walk him slowly out of town. It would be slow, but it would be a start. He went to the wagon. He was halfway through checking the harness when he saw it. The left axle, where the wood met the iron brace, was splintered. It was not a natural break from wear and tear. It was a fresh cut, deep and deliberate, made with an axe or a hatchet. Someone had sabotaged his wagon. He stood there for a long time, staring at the deliberate, malicious damage. And he knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, who was responsible. Roy Manson. This was not about a bar fight anymore. This was a message, a statement of ownership. Lena belonged to him, and no one was to interfere. The thrown shoe was likely no accident either. A few coins in Jedediah's palm would be all it took. Manson was tying him to this town. He was making sure Bo could not leave, because he did not want him near Lena. The day crawled by. Bo spent it trying to repair the axle himself, his frustration growing with each failed attempt. The town watched him, their stares a constant, suffocating pressure. He felt their judgment, their amusement. He was the fool cowboy who had gotten himself tangled up with the saloon singer. He was a joke. That evening, he gave up and retreated to the Silver Queen, not for the company, but for the oblivion in the bottle. He sat in the same dark corner, nursing his whiskey, and watched Lena on the stage. She was different tonight. There was a frantic, brittle energy about her. She sang the loud, bawdy songs the drovers called for, her voice strained and harsh. She smiled, a wide, painted smile that never came close to her eyes. She was performing, playing the part they all expected of her, the part of the hardened, carefree saloon girl. But Bo could see the cracks in the facade. He saw the way her hand trembled when she reached for a glass of water, the way her gaze darted toward the door, as if looking for an escape. The men hooted and cheered, throwing coins at her feet. They did not see the desperation, but he did. When her set was over, she did not go upstairs. She went to the bar and ordered a whiskey, then another. Bo watched as she drank, her movements quick and jerky. He saw Manson approach her, his voice a low murmur, his hand resting on the small of her back. Lena flinched and pulled away, downing the rest of her drink before pushing through the crowd and out the front door. Bo waited a few minutes, then followed. He did not know why. He only knew he could not sit there and do nothing. He found her in the livery stable, standing in the aisle between the stalls. The stable was quiet and dark, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam. The air smelled of hay and leather and horses. She was leaning against a post, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from her hand. She was drunk, not sloppy, but sharp and dangerous, like a shard of broken glass. She looked up as he entered, her eyes glittering in the lantern light. A slow, reckless smile spread across her face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she slurred, her voice a low, teasing purr. "The hero? Come to save me again?" "Lena, you should go upstairs," he said, his voice flat. "I am tired of upstairs," she said, pushing herself off the post and taking a wobbly step toward him. "I am tired of that room. I am tired of everything." She stopped in front of him, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She reached up and touched the bruise on his cheek, her fingers surprisingly gentle. "Does it hurt?" "It is fine," he said, his body tense. "He did this to you," she whispered, her gaze intense. "Because of me." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You are a fool. Bo Ransom." "Get some sleep, Lena." He tried to step around her, but she moved with him, blocking his path. "No," she said, her teasing tone gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. "I do not want to sleep. I want something real." Before he could react, she leaned in and pressed her lips against his. Her mouth was soft and tasted of whiskey and sorrow. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of two lonely, damaged souls. His first instinct was to push her away, to retreat back behind his wall, but he was frozen. For the first time in 4 years, a woman was touching him, kissing him, and his body, long dormant, responded with a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock. She pulled back slightly, her breath warm on his face. Her eyes searched his, looking for something, anything. He gave her nothing. His face was a stone mask. Her own face crumpled, the drunken boldness giving way to a flicker of despair. She was making a mistake. She knew it. but she was too far gone to stop. She took his hand, the one she had bandaged the night before, and brought it to her chest. She did not place it on her breast, but higher, just below her throat, where the frantic beating of her heart was a wild bird trapped against its cage. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a secret torn from the deepest part of her. "No one has ever kissed me there," she said, her eyes welling with tears. She pressed his hand flat against her, forcing him to feel the desperate, terrified rhythm of her life. "Right here." He trembled. A violent, uncontrollable shudder racked his entire body. He felt it then, the solid stone wall around his heart cracking. A fissure, then a splintering, as years of repressed grief and pain and loneliness came rushing to the surface. He felt something break open inside him, a feeling so intense, so overwhelming, it threatened to drown him. He felt everything, and it was too much. With a choked sound, he pulled his hand away as if he had been burned. He took a step back, pushing her away from him. It was a gentle push, almost an apology, but to her it was a shove, a final, brutal rejection. The hurt in her eyes was instantly replaced by a flash of white-hot fury. Her humiliation was complete. She had offered him the most vulnerable part of herself, and he had thrown it back in her face. She shoved him, hard, with both hands. "Get away from me!" she spat, her voice thick with rage and unshed tears. "You are just like the rest of them." She turned and stumbled out of the stable, disappearing into the darkness, leaving him alone in the lantern light. He leaned against the stall, his legs weak, his heart hammering against his ribs. The words echoed in the sudden silence. "You are just like the rest of them." But she was wrong. He was not like the rest of them. The rest of them would have taken what she offered. The rest of them would not have felt that crack in their soul. The rest of them would not be standing here now, trembling in the dark, terrified by the ghost of a feeling he had sworn he would never feel again. She was wrong, and in the ruins of that livery stable, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the terrifying possibility of a future, he knew it, and he knew that she, somewhere deep down, knew it too. The night offered no comfort. After fleeing the livery, Lena had retreated to her attic room, but the four walls felt like they were closing in, squeezing the very air from her lungs. The whiskey had curdled in her stomach, leaving behind a sour residue of shame and fury. She had laid herself bare for that cowboy, offered him the one part of her that was not for sale, and he had pushed her away, just like the rest of them. The thought was a hot brand on her soul. He had looked at her with pity, with a flicker of something she mistook for understanding. But in the end, he was a man like any other. He saw the saloon singer, the damaged goods, and he wanted no part of it. Sleep was impossible. Sometime after the last drunk had been thrown out into the muddy street and the saloon below fell into a resentful silence, she heard footsteps on the stairs. They were heavy, deliberate, not Manson's soft, predatory tread. She knew who it was before the door to her room was kicked open. Cole, Manson's hulking enforcer, filled the doorway, blocking the faint light from the hall. His broken nose was swollen and purple, and his small eyes glittered with a brutish satisfaction. "Manson wants to see you," he grunted. Lena's blood went cold. A summons at this hour meant only one thing. It was Manson's way of reminding her who held the leash. "I am tired," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. Cole laughed, a low, ugly sound. "He said to bring you. He did not say you had to be willing." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. Lena cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain and fear. She struggled, but it was like a mouse fighting a bear trap. He began to drag her from the room, her bare feet scraping against the rough floorboards. Her mind went blank with terror. This was it. This was the moment the fragile control she maintained over her life finally shattered completely. And then, from the bottom of the stairs, a voice cut through the darkness, low and cold as a grave.
Let her go.
It was Bo. He stood in the shadows of the back hallway, a solid, immovable silhouette. In his hand, he held a thick piece of a broken wagon spoke, held loosely like a club. He had not gone. He had waited. Cole paused, turning Lena to face him. "You again," he sneered. "You did not get enough last night, cowboy?" "I am only going to say it one more time," Bo said, taking a slow step up the stairs. With a roar of frustration, Cole shoved Lena aside and charged down the narrow staircase. It was a foolish, arrogant move. Bo did not try to meet him head-on. He simply sidestepped at the last possible second and brought the wagon spoke down in a short, brutal arc against the back of Cole's knee. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. The big man screamed, his leg buckling beneath him, and he tumbled down the remaining stairs to land in a heap on the floor. Clutching his ruined knee and howling in agony, Bo did not even glance at him. His eyes were on Lena, who was pressed against the wall at the top of the stairs, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He moved past her, into her room, and grabbed the only thing of value she possessed, a small, worn leather satchel tucked beneath her cot. He turned back to her, his face grim in the dim light. "We are leaving," he said. It was not a request. He took her hand, and this time, she did not pull away. She was trembling too hard to resist. He led her down the stairs, stepping over the moaning form of Cole without a word, and out into the back alley. The air was cold and damp. His horse, Duke, was saddled and waiting, tied to a hitching post, his reins held by a nervous-looking stable boy who Bo had pressed into service with a silver dollar. "The farrier will have my wagon fixed by morning," Bo said to the boy, pressing another coin into his hand. "Tell him to sell it and the gear. Keep half for his trouble and send the rest to my brother's widow in St. Louis. The address is in the wagon box." He did not wait for an answer. He swung himself up into the saddle, then reached down for Lena. He pulled her up behind him, her body light and fragile. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his jacket. He could feel the violent tremors that shook her frame. "Hold on tight," he said, and nudged Duke into a canter. They rode out of Redemption not with the rising sun, but under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver of moon, leaving behind the wreckage of their brief, violent stay. They rode through the night, pushing the horse hard. Bo chose a narrow, winding trail that led up into the high country, a rugged mountain pass that was little more than a goat track. It was a dangerous path in the dark, but it was one that no posse from town would think to follow. The air grew colder, thinner, scented with pine and damp rock. Lena said nothing. She simply held on, her grip a desperate anchor in a world that had come completely undone. Sometime before dawn, as the first pale gray light began to silhouette the jagged peaks around them, Bo finally slowed the horse to a walk. They had reached a small, high meadow, a hidden bowl of green surrounded by aspens and dark firs. In the center of the meadow, nestled against the trees, stood a cabin. It was more a ghost than a building. The roof sagged in the middle, half its shingles missing. The stone chimney listed to one side, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye, its glass long since shattered. This was no haven. It was a place of sorrow, a monument to a life that had ended. Bo slid from the saddle, his movement stiff and weary. He reached up to help Lena down. Her legs were unsteady, and she leaned against him for a moment, her entire body shaking with cold and exhaustion. He led her toward the cabin, his hand a firm, impersonal pressure on the small of her back. The door hung open on a single leather hinge. Inside, the cabin was one small room, thick with the dust of abandoned years. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, coated in a fine gray powder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with the ancient, blackened remains of a long-dead fire. In the corner was a bed frame, its rope supports rotted and broken. Moonlight streamed through the hole in the roof, illuminating a million dancing dust motes. Bo moved to the fireplace, his boots echoing in the stillness. He had built this hearth with his own hands, stone by stone. He had cut the logs for these walls. He had lived here with Sarah. They had been happy here for a brief, sunlit time. The memory was a physical pain, a blade twisting in his gut. Lena watched him from the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. The shaking had subsided, replaced by a profound, unnerving quiet. She looked at the desolate room, at the broken furniture, at the palpable aura of grief that clung to the very walls. And then she looked at Bo. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he stared into the cold hearth. She saw the raw, naked pain in his eyes. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear and the humiliation fell away, replaced by a sudden, stark understanding. He had not rescued her. He had not come for her out of pity or some misplaced sense of heroism. He was just as desperate as she was. He was running from his own ghosts, just as she was running from hers. He was a drowning man who had reached for the only other person he saw going under. The silence was broken by the sound of a single drop of water striking the dusty floor. Then another. The storm had followed them. A slow, steady rain began to fall, dripping through the gaping hole in the roof and forming a small, dark puddle in the center of the room. Bo seemed to come back to himself. He turned from the fireplace, his face a hard, unreadable mask once more. "We will need a fire," he said, his voice flat. He took a small axe from his saddle roll and went back out into the rain. Lena stayed where she was for a long moment. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she moved further into the room. She ran a hand over the dusty table, her fingers leaving clean streaks in the grime. This was real. This strange, broken man and this sad, broken cabin. For the first time since she had fled her old life, she was not in a place of transactions. No one here wanted to buy her songs or her body. No one wanted anything from her at all. The realization was as terrifying as it was liberating. Bo returned with an armful of dry wood he had found under a rocky overhang. He knelt at the hearth and, with practiced hands, coaxed a small flame to life. The fire caught, spitting and hissing, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the shadows and made the cabin feel marginally less like a tomb. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Bo was consumed with the task of repair. He worked from sunup to sundown, his movements driven by a silent, relentless urgency. He methodically cut and split new shingles from a fallen pine, his axe strokes echoing in the high meadow. He climbed onto the roof, seemingly fearless, and began to fix the hole, working even when the cold rain fell. He patched the chimney with mud and stones. He restrung the bed frame with new rope he fashioned from strips of cured hide. He was not just fixing a cabin. He was trying to rebuild a world. Lena watched him, unsure of her place. On the second day, as he was struggling to lift a heavy log into place to brace the sagging roof line, she went to him. "Let me help," she said. He looked at her, his expression dubious. He saw her slender frame, her pale musician's hands. He started to shake his head, but she cut him off. "I am stronger than I look," she said, her chin lifting in a familiar show of defiance. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. She took one end of the log. He took the other. It was heavy, and the rough bark scraped her hands. But she gritted her teeth and lifted. Together, they managed to heave it into place. A small victory. But it was a victory they had shared. After that, she helped where she could. She gathered firewood, hauled buckets of water from a small, clear stream that ran behind the cabin, and swept the years of dust from the floor with a makeshift broom she fashioned from a pine bough. Her movements were awkward at first, the work foreign to her, but with each task, a little bit of the numbness that had encased her for years began to flake away. She was not being used. She was being useful. The feeling was so new, so strange. It was almost painful. They spoke very little. Their conversations were clipped, functional things, concerning the weather, the dwindling supply of food in Beau's saddlebags, the progress of the repairs. But in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the silence between them less a void and more a shared space. He would clean his rifle, his movements methodical and precise. She would mend the tear in his jacket, her stitches small and neat. One evening, as she was trying to hammer a loose floorboard back into place, the hammer slipped and she struck her thumb. She let out a sharp cry, more of surprise than pain, and dropped the hammer with a clatter. Beau looked over, a question in his eyes, and then, for the first time since he had met her, Lena laughed. It was not a pretty sound. It was rusty, cracked, like an old music box being forced open, but it was a laugh. The sound startled them both. A faint flush crept up her neck, and she looked away, embarrassed. But Beau did not mock her. A flicker of something, a shadow of an old warmth, moved in the depths of his haunted eyes. He simply said, "Let me see," and took her hand to examine the bruised thumb. His touch was gentle, and he did not let go for a moment too long. At night, the hunger grew. It was a raw, unspoken thing that hummed in the air between them. He would lie on a bed of pine boughs on the floor, she on the newly repaired cot. The fire would burn low, casting their shadows long and distorted against the walls. He would watch the soft rise and fall of her chest as she slept, her face in repose looking younger, less guarded. He would feel a deep, primal ache, a longing so powerful it felt like a physical sickness. But he would clench his fists and stare into the embers, reminding himself of his vow, of Sarah, of the ruin that came from feeling anything at all. He would not touch her. One night, after a long, silent day of work, the moon was full, bathing the high meadow in a brilliant, ethereal silver light. Lena could not sleep. The cabin felt too small, the air thick with their unspoken desires. She rose from her cot and slipped out the door. Beau, who had been feigning sleep, watched her go. She walked to the stream that wound through the meadow. The water, fed by melting snow from the peaks above, was crystal clear and black as night, glittering with the reflection of 1,000 stars. She stood on the bank for a long time, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her skin. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she began to unbutton her dress. She let it fall to the ground. She stood for a moment in her thin chemise, a pale, ghostly figure in the moonlight. Then she untied the ribbon and let that fall as well. She was naked. She took a breath and waded into the icy water. The shock of the cold made her gasp, but she kept going until the water was at her waist. Beau had followed her. He stood in the shadow of the trees, a silent observer. He told himself to turn away, to go back to the cabin and give her privacy. It was the decent thing to do, but he could not move. He saw her body, pale and luminous in the moonlight, and he saw the marks, a thin white scar that ran diagonally across her back, a cluster of older, faded bruises on her ribs, like the faint, ghostly imprints of a man's knuckles, a small, puckered burn mark on her shoulder. Her body was a map of her past, each mark a testament to the cruelty she had endured. It was not a perfect body. It was a survivor's body. She turned then, as if she had known he was there all along. Her eyes found his in the darkness. She was not ashamed. She was not afraid. Her gaze was steady, challenging. She called his name. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the still night air, a clear, resonant note that pierced the wall around his heart. "Beau!" He stepped out of the shadows. "This is me," she said, her voice quiet but strong, unwavering. She held her arms out slightly from her sides, a gesture of complete, terrifying vulnerability. All of it. "This is me." And then she said the words that shattered the last of his resistance. Do not look away. He did not. He looked at her, at every scar, every bruise, every imperfection. And he did not see damage. He saw strength. He saw a woman who had been brutalized and broken, but who was still standing, who still had fire in her eyes, who was brave enough to show him the truth of who she was. He began to walk toward her. He did not stop to take off his boots or his jacket. He walked straight into the freezing stream, the water soaking his jeans, his shirt, clinging to him like a second skin. He did not feel the cold. All he felt was the pull of her, an irresistible force of gravity. He stopped in front of her, the water swirling around his waist. He was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that came from the very core of his being. He reached out a shaking hand and cupped her face. Her skin was so soft, so cold. "Lena," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss of utter desperation, of unbearable relief. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving for years and had just been offered a feast. It was the kiss of a woman who had only ever been taken and was now, for the first time, being met. They clung to each other in the icy water, their mouths hungry, their bodies straining together, like two drowning people who had finally, miraculously, reached the shore. Later, back in the cabin, he laid her down on the cot before the warm, crackling fire. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his calloused fingers tracing the map of her scars not with pity, but with a kind of awe. He kissed each one, a silent apology for the men who had put them there, a silent promise that no one would ever hurt her again. He made love to her not with the frantic hunger of their kiss, but with a slowness, a tenderness that bordered on worship. He was relearning a language he thought he had forgotten, the language of touch, of connection, of shared breath in the firelight. He sought not to take, but to give, to heal. And as they moved together, she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulled him closer, and whispered the words against his ear, the same words she had said in the stable, the words that had broken him and then saved him. "No one has ever kissed me there," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She took his hand and guided it not to her throat, but to the center of her chest, laying it flat against her heart. And this time, he did not stop. He did not pull away. He leaned down and pressed his lips to that very spot, kissing the wild, frantic, beautiful beat of her heart. The days that followed were a fragile truce with the world. The high meadow became their sanctuary, a pocket of quiet existence suspended between a violent past and an uncertain future. The cabin, once a monument to grief, slowly began to breathe again, warmed by their presence. They did not speak of love, or of tomorrow, or of the town of redemption. They spoke with their actions, building a life from the splinters of the ones they had lost. Bo, driven by a need to protect, set about teaching Lena to be a creature of this wilderness. He taught her how to handle a horse, not just as a passenger, but as a rider. He stood beside her in the meadow, his hand over hers on the reins, showing her how to communicate with pressure and instinct, not force. His touch was firm, patient, his voice a low murmur against her ear as he explained the subtle language between horse and human. In those moments, with his body close to hers, the air would crackle with the same intensity that had drawn them together in the stream. But it was tempered now with a gentle respect. He was not just touching her body. He was giving her a skill, a piece of his world, a means of survival. Lena, in turn, began to reclaim the pieces of herself that had been buried for so long. She found a stash of old flour and dried beans in a root cellar Bo had forgotten, and she began to cook, filling the cabin with a simple, honest smell of baking bread. She found a pair of old feed sacks and, with a needle and thread from Bo's kit, began to patch together curtains for the vacant window. They were rough, uneven things, but they softened the harsh light and made the room feel less like a shelter and more like a home. And one morning, as she was kneading dough on the rough-hewn table, She began to sing. It was not one of the bruised, whiskey-soaked ballads she had sung in the saloon. It was a simple folk song from her childhood, a tune as clear and pure as the mountain stream. Her voice, freed from the smoke and the leering eyes, was different here. It was softer, with a sweet, aching clarity that made Bo stop his work outside and listen, his heart clenching with an emotion he still refused to name. From then on, she sang often, her voice becoming the soundtrack to their quiet days. They learned each other's rhythms, the way he would fall silent and stare at the horizon, his thoughts 1,000 miles away with his ghosts, the way she would sometimes flinch if he moved too quickly, a conditioned reflex from years of expecting a blow. They learned to navigate these spaces, to give each other comfort not with words, but with a steady presence, a shared cup of coffee, a quiet look of understanding across the fire. They were two broken things, slowly, carefully, learning to lean against each other so that both might stand. But the world does not forget. A fragile piece, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep river, is made to be broken. Down in the flatlands, Roy Manson was a man consumed by a toxic cocktail of wounded pride and possessiveness. Lena was his property. The cowboy had stolen her. He would not let the insult stand. He did not send a posse. He was a clever man. A posse was a public matter, and his control over Lena was a private one. Instead, he sent word out on the wire, to every grimy town and railhead within 500 miles. He posted a bounty, not for a runaway saloon singer, but for a thief. He claimed Lena had stolen $200 from his safe before she fled. It was a lie, but it was a lie that wore the authority of a printed poster. A price was put on her name, transforming her from a person into a prize. 2 men took the bait. They were hard, hollowed-out men who drifted from one dirty job to the next, their souls as barren as the alkali flats they rode over. One was a tall, skeletal man named Elias, with a long, drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. The other, younger and thicker, was called Pike. They were not evil men, merely empty ones, and they saw in the poster not a woman, but a way to a full belly and a warm bed for a month. They found the trail easily enough, the stable boy in redemption. His loyalty, bought for a silver dollar by Bo, was no match for the threats of 2 determined men. They described the trail into the high country, and Elias, a veteran tracker, found the path Bo had taken. The ambush came on a cold, clear afternoon. Bo and Lena were riding along a high ridge that overlooked a vast, timbered canyon. They had been checking a line of snares Bo had set for rabbits. Their conversation easy and light. Lena was laughing, a real, unforced laugh, at a story Bo was telling about a stubborn mule. The sound, so rare and precious, was carried away by the wind. The first shot came from a thicket of pine 100 yards up the ridge. It was not a warning. The bullet tore through the air with a vicious whine and slammed into Bo's left shoulder. The force of it threw him from the saddle. He landed hard, a grunt of pain and surprise forced from his lungs. Lena screamed. Duke, Bo's horse, reared in terror, his eyes wild. Lena fought to control him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. A second shot splintered the trunk of a tree just above her head. Lena, run! Bo yelled from the ground. His voice strained. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale, his left arm hanging useless at his side. A dark, wet stain was already spreading across his jacket. She saw the 2 men then, breaking from the cover of the trees, rifles in hand, moving down the slope toward them. They were not rushing. They were confident, taking their time. They were hunters closing in on their prey. Run. The word echoed in her mind. It was what she had always done. Run from her father, run from her husband, run from her life. But as she looked at Bo, lying wounded and vulnerable on the ground, a fierce, protective rage she had never known she possessed surged through her, extinguishing her fear. She was not the girl in the silk gloves anymore. She was not the bruised singer on the stage. She would not run. Not this time. She slid from Duke's back, her movements clumsy with adrenaline. Beau's rifle was still in its scabbard on his saddle. He had taught her how to use it. He had made her practice, day after day, until the weight and feel of it were familiar in her hands. "You have to know how," he had said. "Out here, you are your own law." She pulled the heavy Winchester from its leather sheath. She levered around into the chamber. The metallic clicked deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. The bounty men had stopped, surprised by her action. "Drop it, girl," Elias called, his voice a dry rasp. "No need for you to get hurt. We just want the man." It was a lie. The bounty was for her. Lena raised the rifle to her shoulder. It was heavy, unwieldy. She rested the barrel on Beau's saddle for support, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She sighted down the long barrel, just as Beau had taught her. She put the younger man, Pike, in her sights. He was closer, a bigger target. "Last chance," Elias warned. Lena's world narrowed to the small metal sight at the end of the barrel and the man standing beyond it. She saw his face, the surprise turning to a sneer. He started to raise his own rifle. She did not think. She did not feel. She remembered Beau's words. "Squeeze, do not pull." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force. The explosion roared in her ears. For a second, she thought she had missed. Then she saw Pike stagger back, a look of profound, stupid surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He dropped his rifle, looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt as if he could not comprehend it. And then his legs gave out and he collapsed into the snow like a sack of grain. Elias stared at his fallen partner, his mouth agape. He had not expected this. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected a woman to stand her ground and kill a man. He fired a panicked shot in her direction, the bullet kicking up dirt a few feet from her. Then he turned and scrambled back into the trees. The silence that descended on the ridge was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind. Lena stood frozen, the rifle still pressed to her shoulder. Her hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in her fingertips and spread through her entire body. The rifle fell from her grasp, landing softly in the snow. She stared at the still form of the man she had just killed. He was just a boy. Really, his hat had fallen off, revealing a shock of sandy hair. He looked like 1,000 other boys she had seen in 1,000 other saloons. And he was dead, because of her. "Lena!" Beau's voice, weak and strained, cut through her shock. She turned to him. He had managed to get to his knees, his face ashen, his jaw clenched against the pain. "We have to go," he gritted out. "The other one will be back." His words galvanized her. She pushed the horror down, locking it away in a cold, dark corner of her mind. There would be time for it later. Now, there was only survival. She helped him to his feet, his full weight leaning on her, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She got him onto his horse, his body slumping forward against the saddle horn. She picked up the rifle, her hands still shaking, and slid it back into its scabbard. She mounted her own horse, took the reins of Duke, and led them away from the ridge, away from the dead man lying in the snow. They fled into a labyrinth of snow-covered canyons, following a narrow, treacherous game trail that Beau knew from his trapping days. The snow fell harder, a thick, wet curtain that covered their tracks and muffled the sound of their passage. It was their only ally. By nightfall, Beau was delirious, burning with fever from the infection that was already taking hold in his wound. He swayed in the saddle, muttering nonsense, sometimes calling out a name she did not recognize. Sarah. Lena found a shallow cave, little more than a rocky overhang, that offered some protection from the biting wind and the relentless snow. She eased Beau from the horse, his body a dead weight. She built a small, smoky fire just inside the mouth of the cave and stripped off his blood-soaked jacket. The wound was ugly, a ragged, swollen tear in the muscle of his shoulder, the flesh around it hot and inflamed. She cleaned it as best she could with snow and whiskey from their flask. Tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage, he thrashed and moaned, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He was lost in the fever swamps, fighting old battles, talking to ghosts. Through the long, dark night, Lena fought to keep him alive. She packed snow onto his forehead to bring the fever down, and forced sips of water between his chapped lips. The fire burned low. The wind howled outside their small sanctuary, and the world was reduced to this one desperate, elemental struggle. And as she worked, she talked. She whispered stories to him, filling the terrifying silence with the sound of her voice, a thread for him to follow back from the darkness. She told him stories of her childhood, stories she had not thought of in years. She told him of the feel of the cool ivory keys of her piano, of the scent of the rain in the gardens of her father's house. She spoke of her mother, a gentle, sad woman who had died when Lena was a child, leaving her with only the faint memory of a soft lullaby. She spoke of the man her father had sold her to, a cold, wealthy man twice her age who had looked at her with the same dead-eyed appraisal he gave his horses.
He never touched my body like he wanted it,
she whispered into the darkness, her voice raw with the pain of the memory, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks.
Just like he owned it, a piece of property to be kept and displayed.
She talked all night, her voice growing hoarse, spinning a lifeline of words to keep him breathing, to keep him anchored to her, to the world of the living. He survived the night, and the next day, the fever broke on the third morning, leaving him weak and frail, but lucid. He woke to find her asleep, slumped against the cave wall, her face pale and exhausted. His rifle was laid across her lap. He lay there for a long time, watching her, the events of the past few days returning to him in disjointed, nightmarish flashes. The gunshot, the fall, Lena, standing over him with the rifle, her face a mask of terror and resolve. He owed her his life. When she woke, her eyes were full of a deep, weary sadness. The horror of what she had done had settled in, a permanent shadow behind her gaze. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the dripping of melting snow from the edge of the cave. In that quiet, stripped of everything but each other, the last of their defenses crumbled.
He was my husband,
Lena said softly, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The man I told you about. I was his wife for a year. I never saw him smile. When I finally ran, I had nothing, just the clothes on my back and enough shame to last a lifetime. Bo listened, his heart aching for the girl she had been. He thought of his own wife, of the easy love and laughter they had shared in their small cabin. The contrast was a physical pain. Her name was Sarah, he said, his own voice rough with disuse and emotion. My wife. The fever took her, and our boy, in the same week. I thought the world had ended. I sealed the door to that part of my heart. I swore no one would ever get in again. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, painful honesty. It left a hole, Lena, a great, empty, silent hole, and I was content to let it stay that way. But then I came to that saloon, and I heard you sing, and your voice. It was the first thing that ever started to fill the silence. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, spilling over and running down her face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, shattering release. He had not seen a whore, a thief, a damaged thing. He had heard her. He had seen her soul. That night, it was too cold to sleep apart. They huddled together under their shared blankets and the heavy wolfskins from Bo's saddle roll. He was still weak, and she was exhausted, her spirit bruised and raw. There was no passion between them, but something deeper, more elemental. It was the profound intimacy of shared survival. He wrapped his good arm around her, and she rested her head on his uninjured shoulder, fitting herself against the curve of his body. They fell asleep like that, two scarred and broken people, wrapped together against the cold, their bodies bare, trusting, and utterly, desperately needed. The thaw came not as a sudden event, but as a slow, quiet surrender. The sun felt different on the skin, a promise of warmth instead of just a cold, distant light. The deep snows in the high meadow retreated, shrinking back from the base of the trees, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The silence of winter was replaced by the constant, gentle murmur of meltwater, 1,000 tiny streams finding their way to the creek. The world was waking up, and with it, a fragile, tentative hope began to stir in the small cabin. They started to believe in a future. It was not a grand vision, but a series of small, concrete acts. Bo, his shoulder healing into a stiff, angry scar, began to cut and stack wood, not just for the coming nights, but for the next winter. The rhythmic thud of his axe was a sound of provision, of faith in a season they had not yet seen. Lena, her hands growing calloused and capable, marked out a small patch of ground near the cabin, clearing the rocks and turning the soil with a sharpened stick. A garden. The idea of planting a seed, of nurturing it and watching it grow, was a radical act of optimism. It was a declaration that they intended to stay, to put down roots in this wild, lonely place. They talked more, their histories unfolding in fragments shared in the quiet of the evenings. They were no longer just two desperate fugitives, but a man and a woman with pasts, with sorrows, with small, treasured memories. They were building a life, plank by plank, story by story. One afternoon, a stranger appeared at the edge of the meadow. He was a tall, gaunt man in a dusty black coat, leading a sway-backed mule. He carried a heavy, leather-bound Bible in the crook of his arm, and his face was a roadmap of pious sincerity. He was a traveling preacher, a man who wandered the godless corners of the territory, selling salvation for the price of a hot meal and a place to sleep. Bo saw him first. He was splitting logs near the cabin, and he stopped, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, his body going still and wary. Every instinct, honed by years of hardship and loss, screamed at him that this man was an intrusion, a contamination from the world they had fled. Lena came to the cabin door, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She saw the man, and her expression was not one of suspicion, but of a deep, unquenchable longing. She had lived a life of sin and survival, her soul bruised and calloused like her hands. The sight of this man, a symbol of grace and forgiveness, was like a glimpse of clear water to a woman dying of thirst. "We have little to offer," she said to Bo, her voice a low plea. But it would not be right to turn away a man of God. Bo's jaw tightened, but he could not deny her. He saw the hunger in her eyes, a hunger for peace, for a cleansing she felt she did not deserve. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Lena invited the preacher in. His name was Reverend Blackwood. He had a deep, sonorous voice and a handshake that was both firm and gentle. He praised the tidiness of their small cabin and the smell of the stew simmering over the fire. He spoke of the goodness of the Lord, of the redemption that was available to all who sought it. He seemed kind, his eyes filled with a placid, unwavering certainty. Bo sat in the corner, cleaning his rifle, his silence a palpable wall of distrust. Lena, however, drank in the preacher's words. She served him a bowl of stew, her movements filled with a quiet reverence. She listened as he spoke of grace, and a fragile hope began to bloom in her chest. Perhaps it was possible. Perhaps a woman like her, a woman with her past, could be washed clean. The preacher was halfway through his meal when he paused, his spoon hovering over his bowl. He was looking at Lena, his head tilted, a flicker of something, recognition, confusion in his eyes. "Have we met before?" "Daughter?" he asked. his kind voice taking on a new, probing edge. "Your face is familiar to me." Lena's blood ran cold.
"I do not think so. Reverend, I have not been in these parts for long."
He continued to stare, his brow furrowed in concentration. "A singer, perhaps. I passed through the town of Redemption some months ago, a town sorely in need of the Lord's light. There was a woman there, in a place of sin, a saloon. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. Bo stopped cleaning his rifle, his knuckles white where he gripped the stock. The preacher's eyes widened as the memory solidified. The kindness vanished from his face, replaced by a look of stern, righteous judgment. He recognized her now. Not the quiet woman in the simple dress who had served him stew, but the painted singer on the stage, the fallen woman, the property of Roy Manson. He set his spoon down with a clatter. "You are her," he said, his voice no longer gentle, but hard as a judge's gavel. "The thief, the runaway." He pushed himself away from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. He looked from Lena's pale, stricken face to Bo's grim, hostile one. He saw not a sanctuary, but a den of iniquity. "You have given shelter to a Jezebel," he said to Bo, his voice ringing with condemnation. "The Lord's work must be done." He turned and strode from the cabin without another word. He did not look back. He untied his mule and led it away, a black specter of judgment disappearing into the trees. They both knew what he would do. He would ride down from the mountain. He would go to the nearest town, and he would send word. He was a man who believed he was doing God's work, and he would see it through. 2 days later, they came. Manson rode at the head of the small group, his face smug with triumph. He was flanked by the town sheriff, a man with a tin star and a weak chin, and 2 newly deputized thugs who looked more like bandits than lawmen. They found Bo and Lena near the stream. Lena saw them first, and a small, terrified sound escaped her lips. She looked like a wild thing caught in a trap, her eyes darting toward the dark woods, the instinct to run, to flee, taking over. "It is over, Lena," Manson called out, his voice oily and possessive. "You have caused enough trouble. The sheriff is here to take you back. You will stand trial for your theft." Bo stepped in front of her, his body a shield. His hand went to the pistol on his hip. "You are not taking her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The sheriff and his men drew their own weapons. The meadow, which had been a place of peace, was suddenly charged with the tense, metallic promise of violence. "Bo, no," Lena whispered, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Please, do not fight them. It is not worth your life. We can run." Bo looked down at her, at the terror in her eyes. He saw the old pattern reasserting itself. The world came with its brutality, and they would flee, hiding in the shadows, always looking over their shoulders. And he knew, with a sudden, absolute clarity, that he was done running. He had spent 4 years running from his own heart. He would not spend the rest of his life running from a man like Roy Manson. He gently removed her hand from his arm. "There is nowhere left to run. Lena," he said softly, "this ends. Here, now." He turned back to Manson and the lawman, but instead of drawing his pistol, he raised his empty hands. "There will be no gunfight," he called out, his voice clear and steady. "You want a trial? She will have one. I will ride into town with you. Alone. We will do this by the law." Manson's smirk faltered. This was not what he had expected. He had expected a bloody confrontation, one that would end with the cowboy dead and Lena dragged back like a recalcitrant animal. A trial was a complication, but with the sheriff present, he could not refuse. "Fine," he sneered. "Have it your way, cowboy." The trial was a farce, a piece of theater staged for the benefit of a cruel and bored town. It was held in the saloon, the only building in Redemption large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. The judge was a circuit judge named Miller, a man with a drinker's nose and an obvious deference to Roy Manson, who sat beside him like a king holding court. Bo stood at the back of the room, disarmed and watched by Manson's men. Lena was forced to sit on a chair in the center of the room, the focus of every leering, judgmental eye. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and self-righteousness. The crowd was a mob. They jeered and whispered, their voices a low, vicious hum. Lena was the town's sinner, the scapegoat for all their own miserable, secret failings. They looked at her, and they saw a whore, a thief, a runaway who had gotten above her station. Manson testified first, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He spoke of how he had rescued Lena, how he had given her a home, a purpose. He told the lie about the stolen money, embellishing it with details that made it sound plausible. He painted her as a cunning, ungrateful woman who had betrayed his trust. Then others were called, men who had frequented the saloon. They spoke of her loose morals, of the way she smiled, of the way she sang. Every word was a stone, thrown to break her. She sat through it all, her head bowed, her hands clenched in her lap, a silent, solitary figure in a sea of hate. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Finally, the judge turned to her, his expression one of bored dismissal. "Well, girl, do you have anything to say for yourself before I pass judgment?" Lena did not move. This was it, the end. She would be handed back to Manson, her brief taste of freedom nothing more than a cruel dream. She felt Bo's eyes on her from the back of the room, a silent, desperate plea. Speak. And then she thought of the garden she had planned to plant, of the morning sun in the cabin window, of the feel of Bo's hand in hers. It was a life worth fighting for. Slowly, she raised her head. She looked not at the judge, not at Manson, but at the hostile faces in the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was quiet, steady, and devastatingly clear. "My name is Helena Marie Cartwright," she began, the use of her real name, a name she had not spoken in 5 years, sent a ripple of surprise through the room. "I am not a thief. I was born in Philadelphia. My father was a merchant. He arranged my marriage to a man named Silas Croft when I was 17 years old." She told them everything, every piece, the cold, loveless marriage, the husband who had treated her like a possession, the quiet desperation that had led her to run away. She spoke of arriving in Cheyenne, sick and starving, and she spoke of Roy Manson. "He did not rescue me," she said, her eyes finally locking onto Manson's, her gaze unwavering. "He bought me. He fed me and gave me a bed, and in return, he took everything else. He took my songs, he took my hope, and he took his payment in bruises and fear. There was no money in his safe for me to steal. I fled his house with nothing but the clothes on my back, just as I fled my husband's." Her voice never broke. There were no tears, no hysterics. There was only the simple, unadorned weight of the truth. A profound silence fell over the saloon. The jeering had stopped. The crowd was listening. When she finished, the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The judge cleared his throat, ready to dismiss her story and deliver the verdict Manson had paid for. But then a voice came from the crowd. "She is telling the truth." Every head turned. It was Millie, the young barmaid from the saloon, the one Lena had defended. She was standing near the back, her face pale, her hands trembling, but her voice was strong. "I saw him," she said, her voice growing louder. "I saw Mr. Manson hit her, many times. He treated her like she was his property. We all saw it." A murmur went through the crowd. Another woman stood up, one of the other saloon girls, a hard-faced woman named Sadie. "Millie's right," she said, her voice rough. "He told all of us that Lena was his, that no one else was to touch her, not because he cared for her, but because he owned her. The tide was turning. The story was no longer about a single, fallen woman. It was about a powerful, cruel man and the women he victimized. The women in the crowd looked at Lena, and for the first time, they saw not a sinner, but a reflection of their own struggles, their own silent endurances. The men looked at Manson, and they saw not a respectable businessman, but a bully. Judge Miller looked at the faces in the crowd. He saw the shift, the dangerous change in the mood. He was a weak man, a man who followed the strongest current. The current was no longer flowing from Roy Manson. He cleared his throat again, avoiding Manson's furious glare. "In light of this new testimony," he stammered, "and the lack of any concrete evidence of a theft, I find the defendant not guilty. She is free to go." A scattered applause broke out. Lena felt a wave of dizziness, as if the ground had fallen away beneath her. Free. The word was so foreign, so vast, she could not comprehend it. Manson rose to his feet, his face a mask of cold, white rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Lena. "This is not over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I promise you that." He stormed out of the saloon, the crowd parting before him like water. That night, Bo found Lena not in their boarding house room, but in the town's livery stable, the same one where she had kissed him. She was standing in the shadows, wrapped in a thin shawl, trembling. He went to her, his heart aching. He had expected to see relief on her face, joy. Instead, he saw a new and terrible fear. "What is it?" he asked softly. She would not look at him. She stared at the ground, her voice a broken whisper. "You came for me because I was in trouble, because I was broken, because I needed saving." She finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But I am not that woman anymore. The judge said I am free, I am clean. So what do you need me for now? Bo, what is your purpose, if not to save the damaged girl?" He understood then. Her fear was not of Manson. It was of being abandoned, of being whole, and therefore, of no longer being wanted. He did not answer her with words. He dropped to one knee before her in the dirt and straw of the stable floor. He took her hands, the hands that had been scraped and bruised and were now, by law, the hands of a free woman. He turned them over and gently, reverently, he pressed his lips to the pale, scarred skin of her wrists. He kissed the old marks, the faint lines left by a life of being held and owned and hurt. It was an act of worship, an answer, a vow. It told her that he did not love her because she was broken. He loved her because she was her. He loved the woman who had played piano in silk gloves, and the woman who had sung for her supper, and the woman who had killed a man to save him, and the woman who now stood before him, free and terrified. He loved all of it, all of her. They returned to the high meadow not as fugitives, but as free people. Yet the shadows of what they had endured followed them like their own shapes thrown long and distorted by a low-setting sun. The cabin, their sanctuary, felt different now, its quiet peace laced with the memory of violence. The world had found them once, and the knowledge that it could find them again lingered in the air, a faint, metallic taste of fear. The ghosts of redemption did not stay in the valley. They rode with them, silent and persistent. Lena was haunted by the face of the young bounty hunter, his look of stupid surprise as the life fled his eyes. She would wake in the dead of night with a choked gasp, the phantom recoil of the rifle shuddering through her shoulders, the smell of gunpowder sharp and sickening in her nostrils. She would sit bolt upright on their cot, her heart a wild, panic drum, her skin slick with a cold sweat. Bo would wake with her, his own sleep a shallow, restless thing. He would not ask what she had dreamed. He knew. He would simply pull her close, his solid warmth a silent anchor, and hold her until the trembling subsided, his hand stroking her hair as he stared into the darkness. His own demons held at bay for one more night. His trauma was quieter, A wound buried deeper. The sound of a falling tree branch, the sharp crack of a log in the fire, would make him flinch, his hand instinctively going to his healed shoulder. And when the summer thunderstorms rolled in, gathering their fury among the high peaks, he would grow still and silent, his face a hard, grim mask. The rumble of thunder was too much like the roar of a gunshot, the flash of lightning too much like the muzzle flash in the trees. He would stand at the cabin's single window, watching the storm, his posture that of a man bracing for a blow. Lena learned to go to him then, to slip her hand into his and stand beside him, her presence a quiet testament that the storm was only weather, that the battle was over, that he was not alone. The damage between them was not gone. It had become a part of the landscape of their life together, a rugged canyon they had to navigate daily. It made them clumsy, irritable. They would argue over nothing, a dropped cup, the way the wood was stacked, a forgotten chore. These small, sharp conflicts were the sparks thrown off by the great, grinding friction of their pasts. The anger was never about the thing itself, but about the fear and the pain that lay beneath, too vast and terrifying to name. One afternoon, Lena was trying to patch one of Beau's shirts, her fingers fumbling with the needle, her mind 1,000 miles away. The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single, perfect drop of blood welled up. She stared at it, and suddenly she was not in the quiet cabin, but back on the floor of the saloon, the taste of blood in her mouth from Manson's slap. She threw the shirt down with a cry of frustration.
"I cannot do this,"
she said, her voice tight. Beau looked up from the harness he was mending. "It is just a needle, Lena."
"It is not the needle,"
she snapped, her voice rising.
"It is this pretending. We are pretending that we can just build a life here, that we can plant a garden and be normal people. But we are not normal people. I am a woman who killed a man, and you are a man who is half a ghost. This is not a life. It is a cage."
The words hung in the air, cruel and true. Beau's face hardened.
"Then what do you want to do?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Run again? Is that your answer for everything?"
The accusation struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her face pale.
"That is not fair."
"Is it not?" he countered, his own anger rising, fueled by the fear that she might actually leave. "What would you have me do? I cannot unkill that man for you. I cannot erase what Manson did. I cannot give you back the girl who played the piano." Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent.
"I do not want you to,"
she whispered, her voice breaking.
I want to not be so afraid."
The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only a deep, hollow ache. He went to her, his movement stiff, and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a second, then collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his eyes closed. "I know," he murmured into her hair.
"I am afraid too."
They stood like that for hours. It seemed two solitary figures holding each other up in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The argument had solved nothing, but it had lanced a wound. The damage was still there, but it was shared. The fear was still real, but it was no longer hers or his. It was theirs. But Manson's final threat was not a ghost. It was a promise. He had been humiliated, his authority challenged and broken in front of the entire town. His obsession with Lena had curdled into a venomous, all-consuming hatred. If he could not have her, no one would. He would not just take her life, he would burn it to the ground. He paid 2 desperate, drifting men, the kind who would do anything for the price of a bottle and a few dollars. He gave them a map, a can of kerosene, and simple instructions. The fire came on a moonless, windy night. Beau and Lena were asleep, exhausted from a long day of clearing land for their garden. The first sign was the smell, a thick, acrid scent of pine smoke that wormed its way into their dreams. Beau woke with a start, his senses screaming that something was wrong. The cabin, usually filled with the cool, clean scents of the forest, smelled hot and oily. He sat up and saw it, a hungry, orange light flickering against the new curtains Lena had made. "Lena, get up!" he yelled, his voice rough with sleep and panic. "Fire!" She was awake instantly. The room was already filling with a thick, choking smoke. The crackle of the flames was a living sound, a hungry beast devouring their home. They had only seconds. Bo grabbed his rifle and the small satchel where Lena kept her few possessions. He shoved her toward the door, his hand on her back, pushing her out into the cold night air. They stumbled out into the meadow and turned to look. The entire back wall of the cabin was engulfed in flames, the fire climbing the dry timbers with terrifying speed. The wind whipped the blaze into a frenzy, sending a shower of glowing embers sailing through the air like deadly fireflies. They were safe, but their home, their fragile sanctuary, was being consumed before their eyes. They could only stand and watch, the heat of the blaze hot on their faces, the roar of it filling their ears. And then Lena screamed, a sound of pure horror, but she was not looking at their cabin. She was looking past it, through the trees. Another glow was visible in the distance, angrier and redder. The wind had carried the embers to the nearby homestead of the Henderson family, a small, struggling ranch a quarter of a mile down the valley. Their barn, filled with dry hay, had gone up like a torch, and now the fire was licking at the walls of their small house. From the direction of the Hendersons' place came a sound that chilled Lena to the bone, the high, terrified scream of a child. Without a thought, without a word, she began to run. "Lena, no!" Bo shouted, starting after her. But she was already gone, a frantic, desperate figure disappearing into the smoky woods. He knew he could not catch her. He could only follow, his heart pounding with a new and terrible fear. Lena ran faster than she had ever run in her life, branches whipping at her face, her lungs burning with the smoke-filled air. She burst into the Hendersons' clearing to a scene of chaos. Martha Henderson was trying to beat back the flames on her porch with a wet blanket, her face streaked with soot and tears. Her husband, John, was frantically trying to release their terrified horses from the burning corral. "Jacob!" Martha screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. "My boy! He is still inside!" Lena did not hesitate. The front of the house was an inferno. She ran to the side, to the small window of the boy's room. It was closed. She picked up a heavy rock and smashed the glass, not even feeling the sting as a shard sliced her hand. She pulled herself up and through the window, tumbling into the smoke-filled room. It was like stepping into hell. The heat was immense, the air a thick, toxic soup that made her eyes stream and her throat close. She dropped to the floor, where the air was marginally clearer, and crawled, shouting the boy's name. "Jacob!" She heard a small, whimpering cry from under the bed. She reached under, her hand finding a small, trembling body. She pulled him out. He was a small boy of about 5, his face white with terror, his nightshirt covered in soot. "We have to go," she said, her voice a strained whisper. She picked him up. He was light, but in the suffocating heat, he felt like an anchor. She carried him back to the window. Getting him out was easier than getting in. She pushed him through, into the waiting arms of his father, who had seen her go in. Now she had to get herself out. The smoke was thicker now, black and oily. The roar of the fire was all around her. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She was not going to make it. She thought of Bo, his face in the firelight, and a fresh surge of adrenaline propelled her forward. She pulled herself up to the window ledge just as a flaming beam from the ceiling crashed down onto the spot where she had been a second before. She tumbled out onto the wet grass, gasping, coughing, pulling the clean, cold night air into her tortured lungs. Bo was there. He knelt beside her, his hands running over her, checking for injuries, his face a mask of terror and relief. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice shaking. She could only nod, her throat too raw to speak. John Henderson was there too, his son clutched in his arms. He looked at Lena, his gruff, weathered face crumbling with an emotion he could not name. He was a man of few words, a man who kept to himself and trusted no one. But he looked at this woman, this former saloon singer who his own wife had warned him to stay away from, and he saw a hero. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of devastation. The Hendersons' house was a blackened, smoking ruin. Bo and Lena's cabin was gone, reduced to a pile of charred timbers and a single, defiant stone chimney. They had lost everything. Again. But they were not alone. By mid-morning, people began to arrive. First, the Hendersons, with a basket of food and 2 blankets. Then, others from the scattered homesteads in the valley, and even a few faces from the town of Redemption. They had heard the news. It had traveled fast, a story of fire and courage. They came not to gawk, but to help. The women, who had once whispered about Lena behind their hands, now approached her with quiet respect, offering clothes, food, a place to stay. The men, who had looked at Bo with suspicion, now nodded to him, man to man, and began to assess the damage. John Henderson, a man not given to speeches, simply clapped Bo on his good shoulder. "We will rebuild," he said. It was a promise. And they did. The community, which had once shunned them, now surrounded them. They brought lumber from their own small mills, tools from their own sheds, and the strength of their own backs. They raised the frame of a new cabin, larger and stronger than the first, on the footprint of the old one. The air, which had been filled with the stench of ash, was now filled with the clean smell of freshly cut pine and the sounds of hammers and saws, the sounds of a community coming together. Bo and Lena worked alongside them, their grief for what they had lost slowly being replaced by a profound, overwhelming gratitude. They were no longer outsiders. They were a part of this place, their lives now woven into the fabric of the community. Late one afternoon, after the others had gone home for the day, Bo and Lena stood alone amidst the half-finished frame of their new home. Bo was showing her how to drive a nail straight and true. He stood behind her, his hand over hers on the hammer, just as he had done with the reins of the horse. She swung, and the nail went in clean. She turned to him, her face smudged with sawdust, and she smiled. And then she laughed. It was not the rusty, broken sound he had heard before. It was a full, clear, joyous laugh that seemed to rise from the very depths of her soul. The sound was so beautiful, so unexpected, that Bo found himself laughing with her. They stood there, in the skeleton of their future home, hammer in hand, and laughed until tears streamed down their faces. For the first time, truly. That night, they lay wrapped in borrowed blankets under the stars. The new frame of their house a dark silhouette against the Milky Way. The air was cool and clean. The world was quiet. Lena turned to face him, her expression serious in the soft starlight. "Bo," she said, her voice a little unsteady, "there is something I have to tell you." He waited, a sudden stillness coming over him. "The garden," she said, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips. I think it will have to be a little bigger than we planned." She took his hand and placed it on her lower belly, a place still flat and firm, but filled with a new and miraculous secret. "I am with child." Bo went utterly silent. His hand, resting on her stomach, was still. His face was unreadable, a mask of shadow and starlight, for one terrifying, eternal moment. Lena thought he was angry, or disappointed, or that the ghosts of his past had finally risen up to claim him completely. He had lost a child. How could he possibly want another? Then, in the deep silence of the high country, a sound broke from him. It was a choked, ragged sob. His whole body began to shake. He rolled onto his back, his arm covering his eyes, and he wept. He wept for the wife and son he had lost, a grief so profound he had never allowed himself to feel it. He wept for the 4 empty, numb years he had wandered like a dead man. And he wept with a joy so fierce, so overwhelming. It was a physical pain, a beautiful, shattering agony. He was feeling everything, all at once. And it was not destroying him. It was making him whole. Lena moved over him, her hair falling around his face like a curtain. She gently pulled his arm away from his eyes and looked down at him, her own tears falling freely onto his face. He looked up at her, this impossible, courageous, beautiful woman who had walked into his life and called his soul back from the dead. She leaned down, her voice a ragged, tender whisper against his ear. She took his lips and guided them down, past her throat, past her heart, down to the new life nestled in her womb.
No one has ever kissed me there,
she whispered. She kissed his tear-streaked face, her lips salty and soft. No one has ever loved me like you. Beneath the vast, indifferent blanket of the stars, on a piece of land that had tried its best to kill them, they kissed again. It was not a kiss of desperation, or of sorrow, or of hunger. It was the kiss of a beginning, fierce, hopeful, alive. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.